MK Party says game on as they announce their new leadership structure, including Floyd Shivambu. What does it mean? Let's find out. Spread the fire. Welcome back to another live installment of SMWX. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and good to have you back on board. If it's your first time watching, welcome aboard. On this channel, we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis videos just like this. Looking forward to seeing you in the live comments, and let's get straight into it. Of course, we had this press conference from Jacob Zuma's MK Party, and of course, Zuma was in fine form. Let's take a look at some of the funny moments that we saw from former President Zuma.
He's just said the voice has gone, blah, blah, blah. It's Jacob Zuma, blah, blah, blah. Hey, Nyangtanda, ne?
And that was just a taste. We're going to get into this press conference, and after this video, you'll have a sense of its importance, what was said, and its relevance to South African politics. This follows on a number of massive videos we've been doing, tracing Floyd Shivambu's departure from the EFF and its importance for opposition politics and politics writ large in South Africa. So today, I'm going to focus on a few things. The first is what was said about Floyd Shivambu, what Floyd Shivambu himself said in this press conference, because for the first time, he started explicating his departure from the EFF. Second, I'm going to look at what former President Zuma said, because he spoke at length at this press conference as well. And then finally, I'm going to look at this new leadership structure of the MK Party and try to explore its importance for the MK Party, but South African politics more widely. So let's kick off with part one, which was Floyd Shivambu. People have been waiting with bated breath to see what he would say as a new member of the MK Party. But of course, first, as usual, South Africans started with jokes. So some EFF members said that Floyd Shivambu went from deputy president of the EFF to managing the decor at MK functions. Have a look at this humorous video before we get into the serious stuff. Like this as a nation? Why are we like this as a nation? We only address seriousness with laughter. And I suspect during this coalition era, there's going to be even more laughter than before. But on to the serious stuff. Floyd Shivambu came out and was asked by journalists, look, at the EFF press conference, you said that you would tell us why you left. You haven't come out to give the full reasons. Of course, we had that letter from Floyd Shivambu, but what was behind this move? And Shivambu answered, and he gave two answers. The first was that the MK Party is assembling a team of people who have a lot of government and state experience, and the other one was about uniting what he called the progressive forces. So I want to take each of those in turn and start by taking quite an in-depth look at what he said about why he joined, because this is the first time that he has really explicated that. Let's have a look at how he put it in his own words.
When we were speaking in the other platform, we made a plea for avoiding of mischaracterization of an otherwise correct and revolutionary decision and act to join uMkhonto party. What President Zuma is doing with uMkhonto party is what the statement of uMkhonto did in 1961 on the 16th of December, to say that now that the liberation movement has been banned, what other platform do we express ourselves? What other instrument do we use to fight for total liberation? There is absolutely no doubt that the liberation movement is no longer existing in the form that it's supposed to do. It has been captured totally. It is directed from elsewhere. And then this is a platform. And what is unique about uMkhonto party is a purposeful, foundational approach and principle, is to assemble people who can govern society to come and govern society in South Africa. It's not wishful thinking to say been identified now. The first consignment that is going to the National Assembly, if you go to check their track record objectively and not bled by these nonsense of right-wing media platforms, you will accept that the contributions that Brian Molefe did in the public investment corporations, in Transnet, in Eskom, you will appreciate the contributions that Esiyabonga Gama did and contributed in Transnet, stable organizations. Whatever can be said, even with the former SARS commissioner, there have been a lot of things which were misled about for a very long time, that everyone else who is not a puppet of the establishment is enemy of the people. That is not the case.
So interesting there from Shivambu, firstly talking about how he's viewed this as a revolutionary decision. We know EFF members are not very happy about his departure, and we've seen quite a lot of attacks on Shivambu ever since he left, particularly since he's made statements on social media saying that this was a sound and best possible decision to leave MK Party. And I saw some members of the EFF striking back, and Sinawo Tambo, for example, really launching at Floyd Shivambu on this. But we'll get back into that in a bit more detail. What I found interesting in this first part is that he says part of the reason he's interested in the MK Party project is because there are so many people who have been involved in the state before who are part of MK Party. One of the difficulties for the EFF has been attracting people who have government experience from before. They have done it with a few different parties, but Shivambu is effectively saying, look, we've got people who've run Eskom, people who've run SARS, people who've run Transnet, people who've run PRASA, people who've been at different levers of the state. Obviously, there's a former president, etc. So his first reason is effectively there are people with experience. Now, that's true, and those individuals have some support. There have been a lot of people who support those individuals, but there is also this narrative that that group was the grouping that was behind the so-called state capture project. And so it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have experience, but on the other hand, you have a cloud hanging over many of these people. But Shivambu clearly moving to suggest that that should inspire confidence in the MK, and that's why he moved there. So that was the first part of his justification. The second part I thought was even more interesting and chimes with a lot that we've already been saying on this channel, and that's about unifying the forces who are in opposition to the ANC. So let's take a look shortly at exactly what he said in terms of his second reason for leaving to the MK Party right now.
I agree that we should unite all the progressive forces into common agenda, because this thing of small, unviable political parties is not sustainable for the future of black people in South Africa. It's not sustainable at all. We can't, and the temptation as well, and I'm not characterizing the EFF, is that when you have got multiple of these, like they end up being fiefdoms of individuals. A IFP, UDM kind of arrangement, what is it to achieve with that? When all of us can set aside our very strong egos and say, I don't have to be a member of parliament, I don't have to be a deputy president. I can come and be led by a collective, like, and be subjected to a collective and be asked to go and organize branches of MKP from scratch and not be a member at the high levels. That is the principle that we're dealing with.
So clearly, Shivambu is interested in this project of bringing together the opposition parties to the coalition government. But veering towards some quite direct, even if not named attacks, even on EFF, by suggesting that there are personal fiefdoms. That could actually be about various smaller parties, but it's clear that Shivambu thinks that there should be one central force rather than this fragmented set of opposition forces. That will irk some members of the EFF to the extent that he may be read to have implied that the EFF is a personal fiefdom. By the way, I just want to shout out to all of you who are in the chat. I see there are over 1,200 people. Thank you so much for watching this live. We salute you. Click that subscribe button. So that was interesting to me, and it was kind of the first time where we may have gleaned some insight into some of the misgivings that Shivambu may have had around the EFF and other parties. He doesn't want to be in a situation where there are lots of different parties all offering the same thing in the opposition to the ANC, and there should be one. And we'll see that echoed by Zuma later. So it's interesting to me. It looks like the MK is interested in this unity project, but I'm not so sure that the EFF is as interested as MK is, because the MK is doing this in some ways at the expense of the EFF, even though that is the one party that they have to unite with. So we have a very interesting dynamic developing where by taking Shivambu, the MK is now moving on to the front foot of unity talks. But of course, they have just alienated the EFF by doing that, and it'll be interesting to see whether bridges can be mended between those two parties. So that was the Shivambu segment of the press briefing today. I want to now move on to what former President Jacob Zuma said, because we heard from him too. And there were a number of points that he made. Let's start off with the kind of tone that he set, because he continued where he left off in previous briefings, really suggesting that MK is a party that is here to bring an eventual and an ultimate solution to the long-standing problems of racialized inequality in South Africa. Have a look.
Because uMkhonto weSizwe is the final answer of the problems of our country. The final answer.
So it's clear that Zuma is continuing where he left off. There was, of course, a reference back to Floyd Shivambu. And one of the most interesting parts of Zuma's remarks was when he explained his relationship with Shivambu back all the way to ANC Youth League days when Zuma was president of the ANC, and why he is so excited, Zuma that is, that Shivambu has joined the MK party. So take a look, because I think this is one of the most important parts from that press briefing.
There are politicians and politicians. This comrade I've known from when he was very young in the ANC Youth League. That's when I picked him up that he is a real politician. His politics, which I defy as scientific politics. This young man, he's a young man to me. Don't worry that he's big than me and all. Honest politician. Honest. Clear political. He takes decisions at the right time for good reasons. And I'm happy that today he told what you all did not know. That when I started, after taking a decision to fight the African National Congress underground, and I had an opportunity to say we needed to come to correct politics about our country and our operations or whatever. I took a decision to meet all political parties, black political parties, to talk to them about the destiny of a black person in South Africa.
So, very interesting moments where Floyd Shivambu and Zuma are united, or shall we say reunited. And yeah, interesting to see what Zuma had to say about Shivambu and the conversations that were clearly going on for longer than we realized. It's interesting. So I think the ANC DA conversations were clearly going on for a longer time than we realized, but also these MK EFF conversations, at least segments of those parties are going on. Now, as I film this, I'm interested, and one of the things that we should all pay attention to read what's happening here is how deeply will the EFF and MK attack each other? And it's an interesting balance, because if they attack each other too much, they're going to destroy each other, and it's not going to be good for either of them, right? But the interpersonal tensions may just lead to that. I have not seen too many intense direct personal attacks between Malema and Shivambu, or Malema and Zuma, for example. So at the leadership level, I think things are relatively being held together. But I mean, anything could happen. And it only takes one of them to say one thing, then it becomes an all-out inter-party political war, right? Which I think would be, wow, quite something, right? Because then the opposition parties would be at war with one another. But it's clear that there is a view that there should be some attacks, especially from the EFF side. So it seems to me that some of the younger leaders in the EFF, which is a familiar strategy that the ANC would often use, funnily enough, with the Youth League. So Julius Malema's, one of his key political roles before was to be the attack dog of the ANC. So when senior ANC leaders didn't want to muddy themselves with political disputes, they would send the Youth League president out and they would do the attacks in the media. And similarly, some of the younger generation within the EFF, your Sinawo Tambos, your Sihle Lonzis, are clearly going on the attack against MK. But I think that's normal. That's the kind of thing you would expect. Some people coming with vocal attacks, but for now, they've managed to keep it relatively contained. So I'll be watching to see if that spills over, say, into the higher leadership levels. But there's clearly some discontent within the EFF, and keep an eye on the extent to which it boils over and we see true conflict, or whether we see a cooling of relations and even more amity after that. So Zuma saying to Floyd Shivambu, I'm really glad to have you on board. I've known you for a long time, and I think your politics are clear, which, I mean, for anyone who's been watching South African politics, the things we've seen, ANC is best friends with the DA, and Zuma is best friends with Floyd Shivambu. If you had told us this 10 years ago, our minds would boggle. But here we are. It's South Africa, people. Anything can happen, and anything should be expected. So following that, we then heard about another, and I think the second major takeaway from what Zuma said. And I want you to have a look at this, and then I'll explain why I think it's so significant. So check out another thing that former President Zuma said about the MK's future plans.
We don't need conferences for now, as we are establishing our party, because conferences have become fake. People use money, they buy people to vote for them and do everything. No, we are saying that is not going to happen to uMkhonto weSizwe. No. That is why we are saying we are not interested in the conference, nice things there, spending a lot of money before we consolidate as a party.
Shout out to the nearly 2,000 of you who are here at like 4:30 on a Thursday. Amazing, amazing stuff. I love this SMWX family, and it's great to see this community joining the live sessions. This is our second one, but we have a big library of videos if you're just joining us. So there, you may think that that's just a random off-the-cuff comment, but I find that particularly interesting, and here's why. I would have expected that the next stage for MK Party, and I even said this in my last video, was to go to their national conference. They have attempted to consolidate the leadership now. And usually what would then happen is some kind of democratic conference where a party would elect leadership and then move forward from there. However, Zuma has thrown a spanner in the works, which has surprised me, and said, no, our next step is not a conference, because we've seen how conferences can, as he says, become fake and get bought. So we don't want the influence of outside money to affect our conference. We're going to take it from here. Now, that's a really interesting move. What it says is that this announced leadership of MK is really the final leadership, or I would say the final interim leadership of the party. And we have no indication of how long that will be until there's a conference, if they choose to have one. So MK is taking quite a gamble here because, of course, there's been a lot of uncertainty and a lot of instability within MK. But what they're saying to us now is that, okay, those were growing pains. We were teething, but now we have consolidated and we're ready to move forward. And we're not going to go to a conference. We're going to keep this leadership in place until we feel we're a solid organization. At some point, I would expect MK would have to have its conference, but it's clear that we shouldn't be expecting that anytime soon. So this will be a big test for MK, but also an interesting learning from Zuma. We know one of his great political grievances comes from the 2017 ANC conference, which he maintains was bought. So he wants to avoid that. And in some ways, I do think the way that South African party conferences happen is quite archaic. There are more modern ways to run political parties and still get democratic input using technology, using new means, and not necessarily doing these big set-piece conferences. But I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the impulse Zuma is following. I think he's just trying to insulate the MK from any potential outside incentives to rock the boat of the party. But interesting to me, so what that means is that this leadership faces a very big test. And let's move on to the next part then, because what we really got in terms of substance from this press briefing from Dr. Sizwe Mpofu, who is the Secretary General, was an outline of the party structure, or what they call the high command. Now, that isn't chosen lightly because that's what uMkhonto weSizwe, the original version, called its leadership. It was called the high command. So today they effectively announced their leadership structure, and I want to take a look at what that leadership structure looks like. As president, we've got Jacob Zuma, of course. Deputy is Dr. John Hlophe. Now, there was some speculation Floyd Shivambu may parachute in there, but that's remaining stable. Floyd Shivambu comes in as national organizer. And that really speaks to a lot of the things we said in our previous video about what I thought Floyd Shivambu would be doing in MK. And very interesting there. Then the chairperson is Nathi Nhleko, who is a former cabinet minister. Deputy Chair, Wilson Sibilwane. SG is Dr. Sizwe Mpofu, and the Deputy Secretary General is Nombuso Mkhize, Treasurer General Menzi Ngubane. So we have a leadership structure. We have a top leadership structure that has now been announced. We know where all the different people stand, and this leadership structure has a lot resting on it because we are told that this structure is now the final, at least final interim structure. MK has had like 4 or 5 secretary generals, and it's not even a year old in public. So we'll see the extent to which that holds. Now, Shivambu's role as national organizer is clear. For those who didn't watch the previous video, it's going to suggest that Shivambu is going to do 2 things. The one is going to be to do the writing of the key policy documents, probably the constitution and the organizational design. And what he will then also do is build branch structures, build party structures, and create those structures in practice that will make up the MK party across the country. So his work is clearly to go onto the ground and build this party so that it moves from just being a popular movement into a political party proper. Now, interestingly for me, no Duduzile Zuma there. So that was fascinating. Another interesting figure who's not in this top leadership, but he's the head of the presidency in MK, I believe, is Magasela Mzobe. Now, he was one of the national conveners of the Youth League. He's a Youth League leader who comes from a similar generation to Malema and Shivambu, left the Youth League to go to the EFF very recently, and then jumped ship again to the MK party. And clearly, he and Shivambu have an interesting relationship that is now going to be quite central to the MK party. So those are all different leaders to watch. You'll see a picture of Mzobe on your screen. That's who he is. I think he's quite an important player to watch, given how he's moved between these different parties and finally settled on his MK position. Now, there was an interesting question put to Nathi Nhleko about gender representation in MK party, where she asked, she's interested in the party, but what about gender? And I think this is a very important question. I think it's a clear weakness of MK. This is a party of patriarchy at the moment, with only one senior woman leader in the DSG position. And I thought the response on that from Nathi Nhleko was quite interesting. So let's have a look at what Nathi Nhleko said in terms of how we analyze it. He said, look, we hear you. This is an important thing. We're building up as an organization, and we're trying our best, but it's something that we need to consider as we build up. However, the SG said no. He disagreed with Mazwai. So it's clear that MK is still a bit at sea on this question. And if it's going to grow as a party, remember that women make up the majority of the South African electorate. And representation, not just in terms of race, but in terms of gender, is a key part of politics in our country. All of our political parties have failed on this, especially at the top level of leadership. The ANC and the EFF are probably the best in terms of gender representation, but that isn't necessarily saying much given the top leadership of the parties. So it's a pity that MK seems to be following the same trend rather than breaking the mold. And inshallah, one day we'll get a political party that understands that question and really takes gender equity seriously. So let's conclude then. And thanks to everyone who's been watching this live again. Shout out to all of you. I don't know if there are any questions that we want to take from the live chat. I can ask our famous producer Oratile to maybe call them out, and I'll respond to some live questions while we're here.
With Floyd leaving the EFF and joining MK, which of the two is in a better position going into the local government elections?
With Floyd leaving the EFF and joining MK, which of the two is in a better position coming up to the local government elections? That's an interesting question. Who's in a better position? I think you always want votes before you move forward. So MK right now is in a better position to me because they have more votes, right? But the EFF is a more solid institution. So it's going to be a battle between MK, which has more popular support right now, and the EFF, which has more institutional sustainability. And that's exactly why Floyd Shivambu is probably left for the MK, is to try and create some sustainability. Because if you get a sound working institution at MK, it's going to be a serious political force, right? But similarly, if the EFF could get some of that support back from the NK, then it becomes a serious force. But if I'm choosing whether I want a solid institution or votes, probably votes if I'm a political party. So I think right now MK is well positioned. But I'm not ruling the EFF out, as I said. I don't think they're falling. I don't think they're going to halve their support or anything like that just yet. People are getting very excited about the EFF, falling away. The EFF is a serious political institution. Julius Malema is a serious political strategist. And I have this interesting theory that this is going to energize both the bases of EFF and the MK. And it may create a certain healthy competition between the two that actually grows both of them at the same time. So don't rule that out, because those bases are going to be key to the next election and exciting those bases. So you may find EFF supporters wanting to come out and show their support for the EFF more than in previous elections. But similarly, the MK will be buoyed by Shivambu's joining the party. So we may see excitement from both, and they may both do relatively well. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes in the election. Let's take one more of your questions on the live stream. That's a great question about the conference thing, and that's why I was so fascinated by the Zuma thing. Look, conferences are actually very risky places, right? Because, and you'll see, for example, right now we have the Democratic National Convention going on in the US, which is their key conference. But that, over time, is no longer a real place where real decisions get made. It's simply a set piece where it becomes a media event, right? If your conference is a real event, there are so many risk factors, right? Number one is a true risk factor, which Zuma identified, which is, well, what if money influences the conference? Number two, what if there's some massive upset and, right there you see the party breaking apart? That's another risk factor. Just violence, tension breaking out. So it's a very risky business to have these live democratic conferences for everyone. And what you really probably want as a political party is to make sure that these things are handled in a way that's a little less risky for you. But the downside of that is that you need to also maintain a certain democratic culture. You don't want everything to be decided by a single leader and then just go through the motions of electing democratic leadership. So the gold standard would be some kind of democratic process, but also a very well thought through conference that doesn't descend into chaos or fracture the party. And I think that's probably why we have seen many parties deciding not to go to these big conferences, especially new parties, because they realize how risky it is. But on the other hand, that's also a credit to the EFF, who, despite the risks of this and despite being called undemocratic, do go to conferences. They've already had one, and you can see how messy the conference process gets because speculation builds, the media loves it, and we get all these subplots and sub-stories. But at the end of the day, you then get a democratic election. So, look, in terms of what I think our politics needs to move into a new era, and maybe we need to digitize some of our political processes. There's no reason why you can't have a democratic process that actually gets like all the branch members of a party to vote rather than these branch delegates who go to a conference, right? So what I think would be really interesting is that you had a process that actually heard from every single person in a party. And that way it's harder to buy an entire party than a few thousand delegates at a conference. And I'd be interested to see how a new political party in South Africa could revolutionize and digitize the democratic process in such a way that the voices of the people on the ground, rank and file members, were heard, and it filters right through into the leadership. So that's what I would do. But I think we're a long way away from that in our political culture. So thanks for those questions. Please, may I ask you, if you're watching this and you enjoyed this, to help us get to our next milestone of 150,000 subscribers. We really are excited about the work we're doing here at SMWX because we are an independent media platform that is trying to break against the mainstream while remaining a credible and trusted source for analysis and interviews. We don't always get things right, and we never claim to be perfect. But what we are trying to do is bring you a different perspective, a perspective that's fresh, that's different, and that is independent. And we always encourage you to go and get all the perspectives and bring them together. But hopefully you get some unique insights here that you don't get in other places. And the only way we can keep building this is if you help build the community, build the family in the strong way that you already have. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for spending your data on SMWX and supporting us. If you want to go even further, buy yourself an SMWX hoodie. You can buy one of my books, The New Apartheid, this best-selling South African book. And, just share it in your WhatsApp group. Tell that person who likes politics, hey, have you listened to this channel? That's how you can really help us. But most of all, it's just great to have you back, and make sure that you stay tuned for our next installment after this one. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Look forward to your comments down below, and have a good one. Aye.